University. In fact, it was quite a pleasant surprise when your colleague Stephen wrote to me to share my work with you people sometime, I think, in August. And it was more so as when I got to know that Neha, who is a colleague of yours now, at reading, is also there in reading. Neha and I actually we have gone to same education institutions in India. So it is really very nice to know that Neha is around. Um, so what I plan to do today is, as already Ju Jung has said, that when I'll present, I have quite a few slides. So if there's a clarification, you can please stop me and ask, and I'll try to explain that. But yeah, broader questions, comments are maybe better to take up at the end of the presentation. Also, I think I would not take more than half an hour, so there will be plenty of time for discussion. Um, so the title of this paper is Hidden from Data, Landholding Patterns and Women's Low Work Participation Rates in West Bengal, India. Now, while um, the central focus of this paper is West Bengal, one of the states of India, I'm actually going to take a comparative frame of few other states. Now, this comparative framework will actually evolve while I'll be dealing with the data and show you why I'm actually picking up a set of set of other states to 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 make my argument more concrete. So let us start with some data directly. Now, these are the work participation rates, that is, worker population rates of rural women. All right, remember it's rural Indian women, and have taken 15 major states of India, basically the larger states of India. And this is 2009-10 data. Now, this particular data tell you very clearly, you can very clearly see that West Bengal, that's the second one after India, is actually showing one among the lowest work participation rates of women among all major Indian states. And not only that, women's participation in agriculture in the state of West Bengal is also, in fact, the lowest. Here, in the case of work participation rate as a whole, West Bengal shows the second highest, Bihar, in fact, the lowest. But in the case of Bihar in this particular year, there is a problem. In fact, later on, when I'll be dealing with other kinds of data, we'll see that Bihar is more or less quite close to West Bengal, to the other eastern Indian state. Now, to tell you that West Bengal is an eastern India is a large country, as you know. So West Bengal is the eastern part of India. So we can see this particular data set show you very clearly this very low work participation rate in general for rural women in West Bengal compared to all other Indian states, and more so in the case of women's work participation rate in agriculture. Now, I have picked up only 1 year, but that really doesn't mean that this is the feature of this particular year. If you look at the literature, we get to know, and if you look at the data, we get to know that this is a historical feature about the state of West Bengal. Women's work participation rate in the state was historically low. But interestingly, that this particular fact that women's work participation rate is historically low in this particular state, which is again from other point of views, if you look at the question of because this is the state which has come to the colonial rule, come in with the interaction of the colonial rule first. So the British education system started in this state first. There were many social reform movements that did take place in this particular state. So given all these facts, together, when you consider this particular thing, that women's work participation rate is abysmally low in this state, and especially in agriculture, this is something that really bothers a researcher who looks at the state closely. So what I would do now, I would quickly take you through. Yeah. So to look at the questions of work participation rate and the question of women's work in general. Theoretically, when we try to look at such questions, we actually see two broad positions. The first position is the question of individual choice, whether a woman wants to work or not, her labor market decision, right? And the other position is more macro position, more structuralist kind of position, from where we know that women's workforce participation is actually determined by several other things. It's not only her own individual choice. That particular choice is actually determined by the structure of the society, the institutions of the economy through in which a woman is operating. In fact, over a period of time, we could see that there is a convergence between these two major theoretical approaches when we look at women's work. So in this particular paper, what I'm trying to look at, trying to do is this, trying to interpret this particular fact that of this low work participation rate of women by looking at the economic structure, some of the asset holding structure of the economy, whether that can throw some light to explain this particular fact that a state which is in many other respects is actually a well performer in many other ways, and a medium level performer in terms of GDP and even human development, some of the human development indicators. Why in that state, particularly women's workforce participation is so low, right? So before entering into the exact question, I would like to take you through some very known facts about rural women's work participation behavior in India, and in fact in South Asia, for that matter, all traditional societies in general. So what we know about women's work in rural India, we know women work in wage work as agricultural laborers. Women are self-employed inside and outside the home. We know that self-employment in cultivation and also in industries which are related to the household sector. And women do various kinds of domestic work in and around the household. And we all know that this is a well-known fact that one of the major reasons behind women's low work participation rate in India and in South Asia as a whole and in other traditional societies is the problem of enumeration of women's work related to the household economy, right? Now this is true for the developed countries also to a certain extent, but not to the extent it is true for the developing countries like, say, India. What we also know is this, that women do a lot of so-called productive work for the household economy, but those works are in a way, are completely intertwined with the household work that women do. A very good example is the pre and post-harvest work, where women play a very important role in India. But remember, the women who do work in the fields in rural India are not from the upper echelons of the society. They are basically the so-called low caste people who work outside in the field. But women of the upper echelon in the rural India also work closely with the production related kind of chores at home, in the sense that they participate quite a bit in terms of seeds, in terms of taking taking the role in husking of rice, the paddy, and so on and so forth. But all these work, in most of the cases, are, as I've already mentioned, is intertwined with her household chores. And as a result, we see that even though she is actually working quite closely with the production related work of the household economy, her work is not enumerated. When the census enumerator comes to a rural household, and when she asks what the people of the household works, usually the man of the household comes out and starts answering the questions. Even if the woman herself answers, she will also not look at her work, her contribution in the field, her contribution related to the production work of the household economy as an independent work. Rather, she would look at her work as the household work, which is not really enumerated as work in the larger data generation processes of census and National Sample Survey Organization of India. Now, this is one of the major reasons why women's workforce participation is much lower compared to men's workforce participation in India in general and in the rural areas in particular. Now, this is true for all the states of India. This is nothing particular. There's nothing special about West Bengal in this regard. Now, then, why? How can you really explain what exactly the reason behind this low work participation over a very long period of time? Very interestingly, economists have actually not paid much attention to explain this particular fact. Rather, the people who have actually looked at this particular question very closely are the historians. And what are the historians basically talk? They actually look at they actually find the reason of this low work participation of women in West Bengal through culture. They try to argue that the cultural norms are particularly strong in the context of Bengali society. So historians have actually documented the exclusion of women from industrial work and paid work, outside work in general, between 1920s and 1930s. They have argued that the growing social and cultural inhibition in Bengal to women's work outside the home during the closing decades of the 19th century, actually it has become even more severe, this whole idea. In fact, taking the cue from the historian's argument, Devaki Jain, who herself is an economist, actually did a time allocation survey. In fact, time allocation surveys are not very common, not very easily available in India, especially early years. Very recently there is a very good time allocation survey. But I'm talking about, say, 1980s, 1990s, during even the early 2000s. During those days, time allocation surveys were not very common. Devaki Jain, in fact, did a time allocation survey, a comparison between two Indian states of Rajasthan and West Bengal. She argued that the cultural inhibitions against women's going out for work is so high in West Bengal, that so strong in West Bengal, that even poverty fails to push them out for work. And she, in fact, gives a very interesting example that in a rural Rajasthani family, a woman on an average takes only about 1 hour for cooking. On the other hand, in a rural Bengali family, a woman on an average takes about 3 hours or more for cooking. Later on, Nirmala Banerjee also looked at this particular fact and then extended this argument and said that this particular cultural inhibition to paid outside work actually led women to concentrate in domestic service, begging, and also prostitution. Now, while there is definitely the sociocultural attitudes towards work must be having some explanatory merit. I'm not saying that there is the cultural questions are unimportant. I'm not at all saying that. But the difficulty, my difficulty with this argument is this: that how a cultural practice can continue, can sustain over a long period of hundreds of years in a state which has actually gone through several economic distress, such as, say, partition. Partition is, as you all may know, the partition of India is actually one of the most serious economic distress that some parts of India have gone through. So there must be some economic reason also that has something common with the cultural ideas that has actually helped this cultural factors to perpetuate over a period of time, to sustain these sorts of practices of women being at home over a period of time. Otherwise, contradiction between the economic factors and the cultural questions, it is very unlikely that the cultural practices could go on over a very long period of time. Why I'm saying this, to give you an example, let us think of Bangladesh. Bangladesh was actually part of India, and in fact, West Bengal and Bangladesh were actually the whole one state till 1947. And the cultural milieu, cultural, the ethos in that area is very similar. And in fact, till the late 1970s, even say early 1980s, Bangladeshi women's work participation rate was even lower than the Bengali women of India. But something happened afterwards that has actually changed the whole scenario completely. And what is that? It's basically the garment industry, the advent of the garment industry. So we could see that a major change in the economy has actually could question the cultural ethos very successfully. So then, so if that is so, the hypothesis is this: either there was there must not have such kind of an economic happening did not actually take place in India, which could in these areas of India could actually question the cultural practices over a long period of time. So keeping this in mind, I started looking at the other states a bit closely. That what can actually explain, what kind of economic factors can actually explain this sustenance of the cultural practices over a period of time. Now, this question becomes even more intriguing because West Bengal is one of the major rice cultivating states of India. And anthropological research, like John Mencher's work, Kathleen Gough's work, K. Sharadamani's work, actually documented that women's participation, rice cultivation, as you may know, is one of the most labor-intensive cultivation processes. And these anthropologists, about whom I mentioned, they have actually documented that women's workforce participation in rice cultivation is particularly high. Women are particularly absorbed, they are demanded in rice cultivation. And if you look at the table with which I started, you can see that the other rice cultivating states of India, like the erstwhile Andhra Pradesh, like Tamil Nadu, in both states in the south, they show very high rates, in fact, the highest rates of work participation by women in India, and quite high participation in agriculture. So to begin with, I thought that I would compare the West Bengal's case with Tamil Nadu and Andhra Pradesh. There's one more important reason behind picking up Tamil Nadu and erstwhile Andhra Pradesh is this, that the technology in rice cultivation in these two states are comparable with West Bengal. So to begin with, my idea was to look at West Bengal in the context of both Tamil Nadu and Andhra Pradesh, where there, in both the cases, rice is the major crop, and rice is a crop that absorbs women in large numbers, that has been already documented, and the technology used in such production process is also quite similar. But Tamil Nadu and Andhra Pradesh shows the highest work participation rate in India among for women. On the other hand, West Bengal shows the lowest. So what, keeping these commonality in mind, what can be the difference? That is what I started actually looking for. Now, as I moved along, I will show you that a pattern will emerge in terms of rice cultivation. So, while at the when I actually decided to look at Tamil Nadu and Andhra Pradesh more closely, what I also had in mind is to look at other major rice cultivating states as well. What are the other rice cultivating states in India? Basically, the eastern region, the eastern Ganges plain of Bihar, eastern UP and Odisha, and of course, West Bengal, and the southern peninsula of Andhra Pradesh, Tamil Nadu, and Karnataka. But because was trying to see a kind of whether there's a kind of a pattern, regional pattern also, I've also included Kerala. But I would keep on, keep on bringing in the differences between Kerala and these other states. So when I started thinking that what can be the difference between Tamil Nadu and Andhra Pradesh and West Bengal, when all these three are major rice cultivating states and the technology is the same, the first thing that comes to mind is this: whether the asset pattern in these states are different from each other. What is the most important asset in the rural areas of India or say South Asia? Is basically, apart from labor, it is land. So therefore, I decided to start looking at the question of landholding pattern and the relationship of women's work and landholding pattern in different parts of India through the secondary literature, basically. Now, what we find from other people's work from the existing literature is this. The first thing, which I have already mentioned, is this, that there's higher incidence of female agricultural workers likely to be found in those regions of the country where intensive cultivation of commercial crops as well as cereals, in particular rice. So commercial crops are again you can think of Kerala for that matter, but what we are concerned here is about rice, okay, which is developed under favorable climatic conditions. Now, my states of West Bengal, Tamil Nadu, and Andhra Pradesh fits in quite well in this regard. In fact, the eastern and southern region as a whole also is quite also quite fit quite well in this regard. But researchers have also mentioned that whether a woman would work as an agricultural wage labor or a cultivator would actually depend on the nature of the landholding pattern in a particular region. Now, it is quite understandable that if a region is very unequal in terms of its landholding pattern, if only a small group of people hold a huge amount of land, if there's a huge concentration, naturally there's a possibility that the demand for labor, agricultural labor, hired labor, will be much more in those areas. And as a result, the demand for female labor will be also high. In fact, exactly this is what the researchers have shown from empirical data from different parts of India and South Asia, that where the inequality in landholding pattern is very high, you would see that there is a high prevalence of female agricultural laborers. All right. The second finding again is that on the contrary, if the landholding pattern is more or less equal, it's if there is not many people having huge concentrations of land in their hands, there the possibility of the prevalence of small cultivators, small holding cultivators will be much higher compared to the earlier situations. So a peasant woman is likely to be a cultivator, much more likely to be a cultivator in such a situation. All right. So with this idea in mind, I started looking at the data afresh. I started looking at the landholding pattern more closely. In India, the major source, the most important source of landholding, ownership holding of land, and also tradition holding of land is the National Sample Survey. But let us remember that there are many problems of the National Sample Survey organization's data as well. That's been described and discussed by several economists over a long period of time. But at the same time, this is the best source, best secondary source that one can fall back upon. Okay. So there are two types of landholding pattern that we see, that landholding data that we get from this source. One is the ownership holding, the other is the opposition holding. Now, ownership holding actually includes all kinds of land. That also includes the homestead land. Now, that means whether a person is cultivating in her homestead land or not, it really doesn't matter. Under ownership holding, this will be included. But operational holding is that plot of land where some cultivation is taking place. That may be wholly owned by a particular agricultural person, or maybe partly leased in, partly owned, or maybe wholly leased in. Okay. The difference between ownership holding and operational holding is basically this, that in the context of operational holding, it is completely the whole area is operated. All right. But we need to remember that the question of tenancy in India is actually decreasing quite significantly. And in the context of West Bengal, which is one of the major states where the tenancy reform took place to a very significant extent, the incidence of tenancy is only 12%. So I have decided to make my life simpler. I've decided to concentrate only on the ownership holding. But then I've already said that there's a problem of ownership holding, that ownership holding also includes the homestead plot where production might not take place. But I'm interested in the area, in the ownership of land where production takes place. So in fact, Vikas Rawal in 2008 actually made a new set of data, a new series of data to handle this particular problem of ownership holding. What he did on the basis of the unit level NSS data of 2003-2004, what he did, he constructs a new series for the incidence of landlessness in different states, where what he did, he considers people who neither possess any land or cultivate their homestead lands. Okay, so that means he has included in his series of data the homestead plots, only those homestead plots where cultivation does take place. Now, this particular way of looking at data, this particular series that Vikas Rawal prepared is actually very important from the point of view of the kind of research I was pursuing, right? Because let us remember that women are most likely to cultivate the homestead plots. Let us take a look at part of Vikas Rawal's data closely. Now, I'll come back to this table once again. Before that, let me quickly tell you some of the major findings from this particular table that I would like to highlight. Now, naturally, Vikas Rawal's idea, Vikas Rawal's objective of his paper was much different. He was actually trying to show that how the land reform exercise in West Bengal has actually, and Kerala and Tripura, has actually changed the landholding structure in those cases, made it much more equal, and so on and so forth. But my objective is different. So I'm not actually taking the observations I'm making. These are not Vikas Rawal's observations. Okay, all right. So the first observation that I would like to highlight is this: that there's highest level of landlessness in Tamil Nadu and former AP. Let us look at this. It is 55% in the context of Tamil Nadu and about 50% in the context of Andhra Pradesh. Okay, I've only picked up a few states. Look at West Bengal, it is about 35%. And interestingly, look at the other Eastern Indian states, say UP, it is about 16%, Bihar, it is about 31%, and so on and so forth. Sorry, I don't know how I missed the states of Orissa, but the state of Orissa would show the similar kind of about 30% or so. Right? So we could see that there's a significant difference between the incidence of landlessness between the southern Indian states of Tamil Nadu and former AP and Karnataka, and in the case of the eastern Indian states. Vikas Rawal has also calculated the Gini coefficient, all right, to look at the inequality, the incidence of inequality in different states of India from his own calculations of data. So what he finds is this, that the inequality is the highest in Tamil Nadu, Punjab, Haryana, and Andhra Pradesh. Okay, so while about Punjab, Haryana is quite well known, about Tamil Nadu and Andhra Pradesh, it's not as well known as it is like in the case of Punjab and Haryana. The third point I want to mention from here is this, that about 65% of people in West Bengal own some land, okay? And it is heavily dominated by smallholders. Look at West Bengal. If about 35% of people are landless, naturally 65% of people will be having some land, isn't it? And you can see that a very large number of people are actually concentrated in the lowest category of landholding. Similar is true for Kerala. Now, this might be one of the major reasons behind, at least in the context of West Bengal, definitely it is related to the land reform. I'll come to that a little later. This whole question of land reform and the landholding structure in West Bengal. So, and if you go towards the upper side, you could see that continuously the incidence of landholding is decreasing in the context of West Bengal, and which is not the case in Tamil Nadu, Andhra Pradesh, or even say the other eastern Indian states. So the similarity between the other eastern Indian states and West Bengal is this: the question of low incidence of landlessness and a concentration, relatively higher concentration of people in the group of small holding agriculture. But it is not necessarily true that in the case of Bihar and UP, the similar case we see when we go towards the end of the landholding situation. There, the Eastern Indian states are actually, again, more or less somewhat similar towards the Southern Indian states of Tamil Nadu, Andhra Pradesh, and Karnataka. So, given these empirical facts from the landholding pattern of Indian states And given the earlier research that I was discussing about the relationship between landholding pattern and women's workforce participation, one can make a, a reasonable conjecture. That is, in the context of Tamil Nadu or erstwhile Andhra Pradesh or Karnataka, where the landholding pattern is highly unequal, where about 55%, more than 55% of people are actually landless, the possibility of women's workforce participation as agricultural laborers will be much more prevalent. On the contrary, in the states like West Bengal, where the landlessness is relatively lower, all right, in fact, almost 20 percentage point lower compared to Tamil Nadu and Andhra Pradesh, the other two major rice cultivating states, and where a large number of people are concentrated in the lower category of landholding, the lower landholding class, those classes. Naturally, the possibility of prevalence of women working in the family fields will be much higher. Um, I can make this conjecture from my data, the way I've looked at the data, and the the research I have reviewed. Now let us look at some census data of the incidence of agricultural laborers and cultivators in the eastern and southern Indian states of India. What do we find? Now, the first point about work participation rate of women in general, that is again, telling you exactly the same thing that we have seen in the first table from the National Sample Survey data. Now, there is a difference of figures between the National Sample Survey data and the census data because the definitions are not exactly the same. So they are not strictly comparable. But because I'm actually taking the data for the same states, over the states I can actually compare, not between the figures of NSS and census. But what we can see is this, the same pattern is emerging, right? We can see that West Bengal actually stands at a very low level of work participation rate in terms of census also. Okay? And on the contrary, we can see Tamil Nadu, Karnataka, and Andhra Pradesh has much levels of work participation rate of rural women compared to the to the eastern Indian states. But the point I actually want to highlight here is please look at the incidence of agricultural workers, okay, agricultural laborers. This is the worker population ratio of agricultural workers. So basically, I have actually normalized these figures by the population figures. Okay? You can see that the incidence of the agricultural laborers, women agricultural laborers in the population of the eastern India is much less, much less compared to the southern Indian states, except Kerala. Now, Kerala's case, I'll come later because Kerala is in many ways very different from the rest of India. Even though regionally Kerala is in the south, Kerala is also a major rice eating state, but Kerala is not a major rice producing state. All right. Kerala's agricultural structure is very different. I'll come to that a little later. So for the time being, please don't look at Kerala and please concentrate on the rest of the eastern and southern Indian states. So this actually fits in with my hypothesis quite well, that the incidence of agricultural laborers are much higher in the context of the southern Indian states and much lower in the context of the eastern Indian states, and especially in the context of West Bengal. But however, how about the question of cultivators? This actually, puts a very, question to the hypothesis I'm trying to put forward. If you look at the figures, you can see that even the women as cultivators, the incidence of women as cultivators, according to the 2011 census, is also much lower compared to the southern Indian states. All right. Generally, the incidence of cultivators, women cultivators, the figures are much less compared to the incidence of agricultural laborers. But even within that, we can see again that the eastern states are doing much worse. But according to my hypothesis, it would have been the other way around, isn't it? The incidence of cultivators would have been much higher compared to the southern Indian states. What can be the explanation? There can be two explanations that can be put forward. The first explanation is this, that the culture of women's working outside the household, outside women working as agricultural laborers, not only as agricultural laborers, but also in the factories, um, since the days of the textile factories coming up in and around the cities like Coimbatore, and so on, we have we know that there is a culture, a very long history of women's of the practice of women working out as laborers in South India is existing. This can be documented from the colonial censuses. In fact, I'm doing another work with a historian right now. In fact, this particular paper is also a part of a book which we are right now writing. So there is another chapter which is focused on the colonial data, basically. And there we have actually dealt with this particular fact, that this particular data that show very clearly that the incidence of women agricultural labor is much, much higher compared to Madras presidency when you look at the Bengal presidency or the United Provinces. Okay. Um, so there is a possibility that because of this particular culture, prevalent culture over a very long period of time, that women work outside, women can be looked at as workers. There may be a possibility, a strong possibility, that the inhibition against women's working outside, women's working or women's stature as a worker, to accept this fact that women can be a worker, is much easy in the context of the southern region um, um, than in the northern or eastern region of India. All right. So the woman who is a cultivator, maybe who is actually a cultivator, is also reported as a cultivator. But in the case of Eastern India, what happens is this, that when a woman is a cultivator, which is most likely that she will be the cultivator, okay, because the land holdings patterns are such that smallholders are more prevalent. So therefore, there will be small holding peasantry, a very significant incidence of smallholding peasantry, and that can be supported by data very well. So the peasant woman is a cultivator along with her husband. And in fact, but as I've mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, that it often happens in India and in South Asia in general, that if a peasant woman who is a cultivator, who is directly related to the production of the homestead, of the home, of the household's own plot, she will not be enumerated as a worker by the census enumerators or the larger data generating agencies, because her production work will be completely intertwined with her domestic chores. As a result, there is a significant possibility of under enumeration of her work. Now, I'm saying that possibility of under enumeration in the context of South India is much less, simply because of this long culture, long history of women's workforce participation outside the household, women's workforce participation for pay, and not only as agricultural laborers, but also in the factories. That was simply not present in the context of the eastern region or the northern region. Okay. The second possible reason is this. If you look at the works of Patricia Oberoi, works of Bina Agarwal, works of Kanaklata Mukund, you see that the incidence of property holding, the property rights, are again much better for women in the southern India compared to the, the vast northern India or the Ganges plains of the east. All right. Now, a woman cultivator owning a land right to herself, it is very difficult to deny the status of a cultivator to her. All right. So that might be another reason why, even as cultivators, the southern women's incidence of cultivation is much higher compared to the eastern Indian women. So the argument is basically this, which I'm going to again try to substantiate with some more data a little later. But before entering into that, let me try to quickly summarize what I'm trying to say. So I'm trying to say is this, that because the landholding structure in the eastern region, particularly in West Bengal, is more equal. In fact, later on, we'll see that historically it is more equal. The prevalence of smallholding agriculture is smallholding cultivating families are much higher compared to the southern region. And as a result, the peasant woman in the eastern India works mostly in cultivating the own the household plots. Okay. And because she is working inside the household, for that matter, she's working for the household's land, her work is intertwined very closely with her other domestic chores. And as a result, she is not counted clearly as the worker. So it's not true that the Bengali woman or the Eastern woman or the Bihari woman or the UP woman or the Oriya woman are lazy. They don't work, and the Southern women do work more. It's not the case. It's basically the problem of underenumeration, and that problem is originating because of the land holding structure. In fact, to tell you a little a little more detail about this, we were in fact conducting some primary surveys related to some other work. It was about child marriage that I was undertaking sometime in 2016-17 in some parts of West Bengal. And before that, my colleague with whom now I'm writing the book, she was conducting a survey on domestic servants. In fact, both of us have a book on domestic service actually earlier. So she was conducting a survey on domestic servants in different parts of West Bengal. What we found is this, that the plots, the land holdings, the generally people have in those areas of West Bengal is actually extremely small. In fact, if you look at the data collected by Haris Gasdar and Sunil Sengupta, which is a very standard work on West Bengal's land reform, you see they have actually shown and also John Harris's work, you could see that the amount of land that per family they own is extremely small. Now the question is this, that whether is it sufficient for a family to survive on that small plot of land? Our primary survey very clearly told us that this is not the case. And in fact, this has been documented by other primary surveys also conducted by wider actually World Development Institute of Development Research. They have also conducted a huge survey on the impact of land reforms in West Bengal during the 1990s. So their findings were also the same, and we were actually conducting our survey very recently. So then what happens? If that is not sufficient, then what happens? Usually what happens is this, that the man of the household goes out to do the agricultural labor's work, and the woman and takes care of the family farm. But even though, because her work is again very closely related to the to the household chores, she will not be reported as a worker. And definitely, the cultural milieu does also help in this regard. So, in what happens is this: here, the land holding structure, the economic factors are actually giving support to the cultural factors, and the cultural factors in turn actually giving support to um, the economic um, scenario. And these two together determines the low work participation rate of women in the Eastern India. Now, let us look at some more data from where we can get a little more support to this argument. I looked at the cost of cultivation data. In India, we have a very rich source of cost of cultivation data collected by the Indian Statistical Organization, CSO, Central Statistical Organization, and that gives us the cost of family labor. Different kinds of data we get. So one of the major data what we get is the cost of family labor per hectare of different kinds of crop cultivation. So because I've narrowed down to rice cultivation, I looked at the cost of cultivation data for cost of family labor for rice cultivation for the selected states of mine. All right. And what you can see if you look at these figures closely, you see something very interesting. You see that the cost of human labor, the percentage of family labor cost in rice cultivation in West Bengal is the highest. See the amount, it is for 54%, in fact 55%. And not only that, if you could see the other Eastern Indian states, each one of them are actually having very high percentage of family labor cost in the total cost of human labor, except Bihar. I'll again pick up the exceptions and discuss about the exceptions separately. All right. Now, I've actually put the 2005-45 rural female workforce participation from the NSS data to juxtapose with these figures. So you can see a direct relationship. Wherever in the cases of the southern Indian states, if you look at the case of the percentage of family labor cost is much lower compared to the Eastern India. But look at Kerala again. Now, this is time to talk about Kerala a little more. Now, again, it has been documented by several researchers. One of the most important names is N. Krishnaji, who showed that over a very long period of time, historically, it is true for Kerala that the practice of wage labor in Kerala is much higher than rest of India. Even a small plot, even if a peasant has a very small plot of agriculture, she actually prefers to employ an agricultural labor, all right, rather than working in the field on her own. Okay, so therefore, in the context of Kerala, Kerala stands actually significantly apart from the rest of southern Indian states. Secondly, the kind of crop that is produced in Kerala, I told you that though Kerala is a major rice eating state, the crop Kerala produces are basically cash crops, right? And they're often grown in very small plots in and around the homestead. Okay, the coconut, the jackfruit, in some cases tapioca, and so on and so forth. All right, but all these require very little labor. Okay, it's very little labor intensive in comparison with rice. There's absolutely no comparison, and rest of it is basically spices. All right. So therefore, Kerala's case is very different because of its nature of its crop, the cropping pattern, and the practice of engaging wage labor historically, the prevalence of the importance of wage labor. Already I've taken quite long time. Neha, is that sorry? Yu Yung, is it okay? How long can I take? How long? How many more minutes?
No, I think you can take a bit more.
Bit more in the sense?
I think it's actually up to you. I mean, if you want to leave more time for discussion, I think you can take 10 minutes. But if you think
Another
that
10
you
minutes.
need more time, yeah.
Another 10 minutes then?
Yeah, I think that is fine.
All right, great. Thank you. Thank you, Yu. All right. So coming back to the argument I was trying to make. So this tells you very clearly, if the percentage of family labor cost is so high, that means that's quite clearly tells you that the people who takes care of cultivation in a particular state, who are these people? Naturally, if the cost of family labor is so high, it is done by the family labor. So it's again indirectly supports my hypothesis that in the context of West Bengal, it is basically the small holding agriculture, and it is basically cultivated the by the family labor. And the moment you talk about family labor, we must remember that adult women's work, adult women's labor must be very important in that context. Okay. Um, but I need to talk about two more states here, not only Kerala. The other two states are Odisha and Bihar. Now, why I'm picking up Odisha? Now, if you remember about Odisha's landholding pattern, I mentioned that it is quite similar to the other eastern Indian states. Like not many, the incidence of landlessness is quite low. Um, and you could see the percentage of family labor cost is also pretty high in the context of Odisha. So this fits in quite well. These two data are fitting in quite well. But what is not fitting in well is the higher incidence of women's workforce participation. In fact, Odisha stands out if you look at the eastern Indian state. Odisha is a rice cultivating state. Odisha is a small holding a peasant economy. Odisha's percentage of family labor cost is pretty high. Everything is fine. But then in the case of Odisha, the work participation rate of women is much higher compared to rest of the eastern Indian states? Let us take um, two more. Take a look at two more tables, some more data. This is the data that tells you the percentage of tribal population in these six or seven states of India about which I'm concerned with. You can see that Orissa actually stands apart in a very significant way. It's about 22% of total population of Orissa is tribal population. All right. Now, this has a very important significance. All right. What is that significance? That significance will be told to you by this particular figures from 2011 again. You can see that the rural women's work participation rate, this has been looked at, the rural women's work participation rate for all women, for scheduled tribe women, and for scheduled caste women. All right. You can see that the work participation rate of scheduled tribe women are again way apart from the work participation rate of all women and also even the scheduled caste women. All right. So this clearly explains the case of Orissa. While Orissa has all similarities with other Eastern Indian states, simply because of the fact that the percentage of tribal population is very high in Orissa, and of the fact that the work participation rates of tribal people in general in India and in South Asia, in general in South Asia and in particular in India, is much higher compared to the rest of the population. We can easily say that Odisha's work participation rate has been dragged up as a result of this. Okay. Otherwise, if you look at the other factors, Odisha fits in quite well in other respects in my hypothesis. Okay. Now, the last point I want to, in fact, I wanted to talk about post-land reform, or sorry, pre-land reform era also. But if there are questions, I can take that up later. I'll be very happy to do that. But let me very quickly talk about Bihar. Now, in the context of Bihar, what we see is this from the cost of cultivation data, that Bihar is actually showing much lower percentage of family labor cost. In fact, the percentage of family labor cost is quite close to the southern Indian states. Now, Bihar is a small peasant economy that we have seen from the landholding structure. Bihar's female work participation rate is pretty low. That is quite, quite all right with the kind of hypothesis I'm trying to put forward. But in that case, if that is so, then Bihar's percentage of family labor cost should have been much higher, like the Eastern Indian states. Here again, you need to look at the structure of the landholding more closely in the context of Bihar. Now, earlier when I discussed about the landholding, the inequality, the incidence of inequality of landholding pattern from Vikas Rawal's work, I mentioned that Vikas actually has looked at Gini coefficient. We know the problem of Gini coefficient. Gini coefficient actually summarizes the data. It gives average idea. Okay, so a much more, a finer way of looking at the inequality of landholding pattern is to look at the ratio between the share of land by the top 5% household and the share of land by the bottom 50% household. By this figure, if we look at, you can see how interesting this data is. In the case of, in the case of Tamil Nadu, the share of land by the bottom 50% naturally is actually zero, because 55% were actually landless, right? And in the context of, again, West Bengal is actually quite good. It's a 4.62 or something like that. But among the Eastern Indian states, it is Bihar which shows the highest landholding inequality. And not only that, if you look at the share of land by the top 5% households, you can see again Bihar stands quite apart, in fact quite close to the southern Indian states. It's it's more than 39% or so, right? So that means in Bihar, the landholding structure is such that while there is a large number of people are concentrated at the bottom, a large number of people who are actually not landless, but they are concentrated in very small holdings. On the other hand, there are a significant number of people, they're concentrated on the higher side. These figures are actually telling you very clearly this. In fact, the first table from Vikas Rawal's work also tells you this fact very clearly. So therefore, there must be, if this is the land holding structure, it is quite likely that there is a significant demand for the wage labor. And this incidence of demand is much less compared to the cases of, say, West Bengal, Odisha, or Uttar Pradesh, where this inequality is much less. There should be people, isn't it, to hire the agricultural laborers. There should be demand in the labor market. While there should be supply, there has to be demand to have a particular outcome. So Bihar's case is therefore different in this way because the landholding structure is different, especially as you go towards the end. As I said that I would have been very happy to talk about the pre-land reform era in West Bengal because I said that women's low work participation rate is a historical fact in the state of West Bengal. And my findings, in fact, can substantiate this argument that the um, the small holding peasantry was actually prevalent even before land reform. Land reform actually did not do much in that regard, to be very frank, in from that perspective. Um, thank you, thank you for your patience, and I'll be very happy if there are questions. Should I stop sharing my slides, or we might require them?
No, I
Do
think
you? Yeah.
yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Should I?
So
Yeah.
no, I think if you want to keep it, you can keep it, and then if somebody
Oh,
asks you question about the slide, you can just easily move around, right?
all right. Sure.
Yeah. So thank you very much. Yeah, it's very interesting. So if you have any questions, okay, please raise your hand.
But you have to assist me in that regard, okay? Because I can't see, because I can see my slides only. All right. Do you? Is that fine?
Oh yes. Yeah, it's
Okay.
fine.
Thank you.
Yes. So yeah. So yeah, I will moderate. Yeah.
Yes. Please do.
Yeah, but actually, I have one case. I think I was not really clear when you talk about land holding. So initially, I thought that you're talking about females land holding, but in between, I was a little bit confused. It's like you're just talking about land holding for the whole the population, not for only not only for female. So for example, in this slide, you're talking about land holding. Is it about the females land holding, or it's about for all the population?
No, it's population's landholding. It's landholding structure as a whole. In fact, to tell you that in India, women hardly hold land. Hardly women have the property right, especially in the northern and eastern India.
Yes, that's what I thought. Actually, that's what I thought. But because in the title you're talking about females land holding, so I was a bit confused. Okay, thank you.
It's a different context, actually. That was in the context of southern India, where the incidence of
Okay, yeah.
landholding by women is much better compared to there. Also, it's bad, but better with respect to the other parts of India. Yeah,
Uh,
yeah. Should I take some more questions and then answer, or how do you want, you? How should I do it?
I mean, yes, feel free. Yes, you can answer now, and then we can, because we have still 18 minutes. We can take you answer first, and then we can take more questions later.
Sure, sure. So, could I clear your confusion, or should I elaborate a bit on this?
Oh, yeah, I think if you can do it a bit more, I think that would be great.
Okay, sure. Yeah, what I was trying to say, that um, uh, I started looking at the landholding pattern, the landholding structure, because the landholding structure can actually determine what kind of work a woman would do, whether she would work as an agricultural laborer or she would work as a cultivator. Now, it really doesn't matter that whether the woman owns the land or the man owns the land. If I look at it from a broader point of view, I'll come to the finer issues a little later about who owning the land and how it can influence. Now, for the time being, I'm not entering into that finer distinction of who is owning the land. I'm basically looking at the ownership structure of the land, whether the land, in the whole of South Asia and in general, and in India in particular, the landholding structure is very heavily skewed. Okay, only a very few people having a huge amount of land in their hands. The concentration is very high, and then there is a large number of people who are having tiny plots of land. Okay, so the graph is like asymptotic towards the towards the horizontal axis. If you try to draw it, if I would have had a board, I would have very happy to draw the landholding pattern, the graph of the landholding pattern in India. Right. So what I was trying to argue is this: that in an economy, in a state, if the landholding pattern is relatively more equal, if there is a state where I can see that the maximum amount of land is actually held by small peasants and there are not many large holders, the concentration of land in few hands is much less. In that context, the demand for hired labor will be much less in general. All right. If the demand for hired labor in general is much less, because if there are not many large holders, who will demand for hired labor? People, the small holders, will cultivate their own land by themselves, by the family labor, which came out from the cost of cultivation data. So in those cases, the possibility of a woman to work as a cultivator will be much higher in comparison with a situation where the landholding pattern is very highly skewed, since only a small group of people holding a very significant amount of land. The concentration of land in few hands is very, very high. In those cases, in general, the demand for labor will be much higher. And because people are landless as well, a large number of people are also landless. So the supply of labor will be also there. So we see the labor market outcome is that the incidence of hired labor in general will be much high. And naturally, in the case of women, this will be also true. And this is more so because I said that rice cultivation is heavily dominated by women. That has been coming out from the anthropological research. Okay. And it is just a common fact. If you travel over South Asia, over different parts of India, different parts of Bangladesh, especially Bangladesh and India, because they are rice cultivating, majorly rice cultivating areas. You could see that how many women are actually working in the fields. Okay, this back breaking kind of work that women do. Right? So therefore, when there is high demand in general for hired labor, one can expect that the demand for labor, women labor, will be also high. So this was my general observation. Okay, and then in that context, I tried to look at the incidence of agricultural labor and cultivator in the states of my concern, rice cultivating states. All right, and I've seen that the incidence of agricultural laborers are much lower in the context of West Bengal in particular and Eastern India in general, which was quite expected because these are the states which have much lower inequality in landholding structure. And the southern Indian states, which are characterized by very large inequality. So the prevalence of hired labor will be much higher. But what I did not see is this, which I also expected, that the incidence of cultivation among women will be high then in the case of the Eastern India, but it hasn't happened that way. Okay. In that context, I brought in two explanations. The first explanation I brought in is the outside work culture, the lesser, strictures on women's work prevalent in southern India. That has been documented by several people. So that might have actually helped in terms of better reporting of women, even though if they're working as cultivators. That was my first argument. And the second argument is this. In that context, I've brought in the question of property right or land holding by women. I said that generally in India or in South Asia, women don't have property rights over land. But from the works of the sociologists like Patricia Oberoi, like Beena Agarwal, economist, of course, like Kanaklata Mukund, you could see that the property right over land is much better. The incidence of property right over land is much better in southern India over a historical time. Okay, so therefore, again, a woman who has property right over land, it is much more difficult to deny her as a worker when she's a cultivator in a family plot. Is it okay now?
Oh, yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you very
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think Maxim has a question. Maxim,
Yeah.
please
Yeah.
ask her question.
Yeah, it's Maxim. I thank you very much. I mean, I enjoyed the presentation, of course, as I like the style as well. So it's really non-orthodox style. I liked it's this all insights. But at the same time, when it's a regression analysis, so you look at the coefficient and a lot of things are controlled for. When you pick up different factors one by one, there may be a chance that something else is still missing and you haven't looked at some other patterns that possibly can also explain the distribution of or woman participation. For example, religion in the West Bengal. We haven't seen this data. Or, as you said, woman ownership, woman land ownership, or man land ownership, etc. Or leisure time. Perhaps they use land for leisure, to relax in the garden rather than cultivating rice or whatever they have. Again, so some more things I might just concern. There may be some omitted factors. While I trust the story, I believe the story. I wonder, you went for the solution for the answer to India. You compared Tamil, Andhra Pradesh, Orissa, other places. Why didn't you go to in your research in Bengal, in East Bengal, in Bangladesh, and find the answer there? Why did you go to answer in India? Okay, that's my question.
Thank you, Maxim. Thank you very much. Now, my first answer about regression, I purposefully did not take up an econometric work because the kind of data I'm handling, it doesn't really permit me to do a proper econometric work. All right. Now, secondly, it's an explorative data analysis. That's what I've done. So it's not strictly a work of econometrics. I'm not even interested in visualizing my work in that way, because I believe that while, as you were saying, that through a regression analysis, I would have seen certain things more clearly. I would believe that the kind of data I'm actually handling with, it's very difficult to capture through a regression analysis. All right. Now the question of religion, yes, you haven't seen I haven't brought in the question of religion because there's hardly any difference. All right. I would have actually mentioned, in fact, I mentioned carcidily when I talked about Bangladesh. If you look at the question of Bangladesh, in fact, it's not true that I did not look at Bangladesh. I did mention, and I'll again mention Bangladesh. And in fact, to begin with, when I started my explanation, my um, reasoning behind why I'm actually looking at the question of whether there's a conflict between the cultural ethos and the economic factors or not, I brought in the question of Bangladesh. Now, Bangladesh is a Muslim-dominated country, and Indian part of Bengal is a Hindu-dominated territory. All right. But if you look at the colonial Bengal, which is actually both Bengals were together, and I was telling you that I've actually right now I'm doing some work on colonial Bengal. I see exactly the same kind of cultural specificities. They are shared very closely by both the Hindus and the Muslims. All right. But very interestingly, after independence, after say around 19, late 1970s, early 1980s, as I was mentioning, that we see that women's work participation rate changes dramatically in the context of Bangladesh. Is it because of religion? I very much doubt. Because if that is so, then it should have happened in Pakistan also, all right, or in Bangladesh much earlier, or in East Bengal for that matter during the colonial years. Rather, what has happened is a very important economic change that is absent in the context of West Bengal or Eastern India in general. And what is that? That is the advent of the garment manufacturing. You might be knowing that um, about more than 60% of the garment manufacturing workers are women workers. And very interestingly, they're all coming from the villages, from the rural areas. They're not the dwellers of the city of Dhaka or Chittagong. Okay? They're all rural women, rural single women who migrate from the rural areas to the urban areas. And remember that they were equally conservative before the advent of the garment manufacturing industry. Now, this huge economic opportunity in the context of an abject poverty, that has actually changed, that has actually questioned the cultural ethos, that has actually changed the ways of thinking. And again, interestingly, if you look at that, what happens is this, that that the things like child marriage, again, the population studies people like Amin, I think she has shown, a paper came in Population Development Studies. She shows that how, as a result of the increasing participation of women in the garment manufacturing, actually changed the incidence of child marriage and the increase in the childbearing age. All right. But this wasn't the case till, say, late 1970s, early 1980s. There's a sudden change. And in fact, she shows this change, she relates this change directly with this huge change in the economy that did take place, which is absent in the Eastern India. Now, why I have concentrated on Eastern India? Because I'm actually trying to see the pattern. I'm trying to find out a pattern in terms of the landholding scenario, and at the same time, where there is no drastic economic change has taken place. So that is my concern. I should have made it more clear at the beginning, but I think I did mention that why Bangladesh was not directly a concern of mine, and because particularly this particular incident did happen in Bangladesh, and this sort of a thing did not happen in the context of the Eastern Indian states, particularly.
If I just quickly ask, if I would be a policymaker thinking of taking women to labor market in West Bengal. So would that be a wise to you? I mean, would the development of textile industry, for example, like in Bangladesh, do you think the same should there will be a development of textile industry in West Bengal? Would the Basque women in West Bengal react the same way as in Bangladesh, and they would just moved to industry, like industrialization?
It depends on how that industry performs. Bangladesh's success in the garment industry is a historical international trade outcome. All right. There's a question of quota hopping by South Korea, and as a result of that, the Bangladesh, the success story of Bangladesh did take place. Now, exactly that would happen in West Bengal or not, as a result of a particular industrialization, is difficult to say. But what is quite true is this, that the industrialization experience in West Bengal is continuously declining. Since the days of the colonial rule, in fact, the colonial, the industrialization of jute industry, that has actually destroyed. Basically, there's no indigenous entrepreneurship in jute. It was all British entrepreneurship, all right? And after the partition, that whole area, since the partition, the whole area, the whole Eastern India, and Calcutta and in and around that area, the industrialization experience is declining every day. At one point, just immediately after independence, West Bengal was at the first position, but today it is I think some 20th, or this is the position of West Bengal, and every day the industry is declining. So naturally, industrialization, of course, is an outcome. Is something, not an outcome. Sorry, is definitely an answer for better absorbment of of women labor. But I'm basically, please remember, I'm basically talking about rural women, rural workers. So my answer is rather the ownership, uh, giving the ownership of land to women. Now, what has happened after during the land reform exercise in West Bengal is this, that that has happened under a left rule, you might know, and though it was definitely one of the major exercises, major incidents in this area, but very sadly, not a single plot has been actually given to women or in joint title. This was when this started being, criticized, that this has been happening, and as a result there's a huge gender inequality growing. People have started criticizing. By the late 90s 19 or the mid 1990s, the left front government, the then left front government, started changing its policy, but by then much of the land was already being distributed. So my answer to your question is this, that it will be better if women get the land right. So there is a possibility of her being acknowledged as a cultivator, her being able to handle her land, to take a decision about her land is much more fruitful, rather than just thinking of, just because Bangladesh is doing very well in terms of garment industry, West Bengal should also, run for garment industry, without thinking of the fact that it's already quite late, and to enter into the international market is not easy. And Bangladesh's entry was there's a historical context about it.
Well, thank you very much. Very, very interesting, really. And I've learned a lot from the answers and the presentation. I also have a paper published last year on firm growth and women entrepreneurship in Bangladesh, India, and Pakistan. So that's why I was quite interested in this topic.
Oh, that's interesting. Okay, yeah. Mm-hmm. So we do share interests then.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay. Deepita, thank you very much. I think we don't have any more time, unfortunately, but I really enjoyed your talk, and I'm sure it's the same for others. And yes, it was really nice to have you in our seminar series.
Thank you very much to all of you for your patience and listening to me and giving me this opportunity. And thank you.
Yes. Thank you for others to attending today's seminar, and I hope you all enjoyed the rest of the day. And then I will see you next week again. Bye, everyone.
Bye. Thank you, everybody. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.